Hello everyone, this is the Good Captain. Welcome to tutorial video number 3 in my series on the Midway Guadalcanal game system produced by Avalon Hill. Before we get into the content, I will say that it is not necessary to have watched the first two tutorials to understand this one. This one can stand on its own. And to help in this tutorial, I have partially set up the operation known as the Battle of the Eastern Solomons out of the Guadalcanal game, and only half of the board, the western half, the bases of the Japanese Rabaul, Gazmata, and Leh versus Port Moresby and Gili Gili. There are no ship units in this tutorial. There are no scout units. Both of those unit types and their interaction on the search board and on the operations card will be discussed in a future tutorial. This tutorial is strictly air operations, how to launch aircraft, how to recover aircraft, and how to conduct combat both between air units and bases and air units. And I decided to do it this way because the air operations on a carrier are identical to those in a base on this game, and the air combats are all identical too. So this is just a cleaner, easier, more streamlined way to cover all the rules necessary to fight effectively using this game system. Okay, first let's go over the combat air unit types. There are 5 combat air unit types, and I have 4 of them laid out on the board here. There's 5, and they are denoted by a letter in the top left-hand corner of the counter. So F stands for a fighter unit, not pictured as D for dive bomber, torpedo bombing units, medium bomber units, and high-level bomber units, okay? The top right number in each of these counters is the defense factor, same as the ships. The bottom right is the range, or the number of hexes that an aircraft can move on the search board. The bottom center is the bombing factor, if it has one. This unit up here doesn't, it's a fighter. The bottom left-hand number is the air unit's attack factor. So if this air unit is attacked by an enemy fighter, this is the number that it gets to shoot back at the enemy air unit with when it's its turn to fight. Okay. Now in regards to bases, these function very much like ships, but the top right, again, is the defense factor. And the number second from the right, Rabaul has 2 numbers, right? So this is the surface factor right here, just like on a ship. But the number on the bottom here is the anti-aircraft factor, positioned second from the right on the bottom. So next, let's talk about the bases. Well, since we got the American operation or the Allied operations card up, let's talk about Port Moresby. So each base has its own base box here, let's call it, and top left is the capacity, or the number of air units, number of full air units that each base can house. And so doing just a quick count, we see that the Americans have 9 full air units, and by full air units, just understand that anything with a white stripe is considered half of an air unit because it's a unit that's essentially been flipped. So those count as halves. So we have 9 full air units. It's just important to keep in mind the capacity, because look at Gili Gili. It's got only a capacity of 6, so it's a much smaller base when compared to Port Moresby. Okay, in the top right-hand corner, we have a number, a slash, another number, and then the word launch. This is the launch capacity. So Port Moresby can launch 10 air units as long as the base is on its front side. If it's flipped to its back side, it can only launch 5 air units. This is to represent, of course, the damage to the airfields and other facilities, and effectiveness in launching large amounts of aircraft. Moving on down, we see that the words on ground, when the aircraft are located on the ground in an airbase, they are either in either of these 2 positions, in the ready box or in the arming box. And we'll get into the meaning of those when we actually start fighting in this tutorial. Then we see normal strike and max strike on the left, and high cap and low cap on the right. And those, again, are best described when we actually are pushing pieces in the scenario. So let's get to it. Just like in surface combat, when you're playing on the operational map and you're going through a turn, there's a sequence of play. You can just dab the button there or check it out in the manual. And you just follow you just do what it says at the top here. So use competitive die rolls to determine side A and B. Record that on the time record track, and side B performs the step or phase first, and then side A does so. Perform these steps in this order, and let's go ahead and roll that dice. See who gets side A and side B. So the Japanese will roll first. They get a 5, and the Americans roll a 3. So the Japanese will be side A in this turn, which means the Allied side will do everything first. Now remember that the operations cards are visible to your opponent, so it's beneficial to kind of see what they're doing first before you go so that you can respond. When we go back to the sequence of play here, we read that the assembly step is the first thing to do in the action phase, and this is basically the takeaway here is we are ordering all units that are available to take off for this turn and fly. Now, eligible units are any unit that can fly for this turn are units that are only in the ready box. If there's anything in the arming box, it can't fly this turn. Now, fortunately for us, the Americans have everything in the ready box ready to go. And so let's talk about what we can do here. Any units with a bombing factor, again, this is a number in the bottom center of the aircraft counter, really can only do one of two things from the operations card here, at least from the position of the ready box, as all of these bomber units are in currently. They can take off to fly this turn and try to attack a target or just be flown out, even if they don't attack a target, or they can be moved back into the arming box. Now, in this situation, we have land-based targets within range of all of our bomber units, so we will commit them all to fly strikes. So let's stack them all up. We're not worried about destinations. We don't have to designate anything just yet. Just do we want them to fly out or not? So we'll put them in the normal strike box. The fighters, on the other hand, can really do the same thing. They can go to the arming box. They can take off to fly as essentially escorts for the bomber units, or they can do another thing, and that is fly combat air patrol or fly air cover for the base they originate from or any base that's in range. And we're going to make the decision to simply commit all of our fighter aircraft to combat air patrol. So we'll put them in the combat air patrol box for the time being. We'll put them in high cap positions, and you're just going to put them in normal strike and high cap. We're going to get to the other boxes here when we get to the Japanese side of this phase. Okay, so now it's the Japanese turn to do the assembly step, and keep in mind that the Japanese player, being side A, can watch what the Allied player does first and sort of respond to that. It might be a little unrealistic, you might be thinking, but it is a game. It has its advantages and disadvantages, and it does try to kind of balance things out. So hopefully I can articulate how that plays out here in this tutorial. So we can see that Port Moresby is throwing up a lot of combat air patrol, and that the bombers will be essentially unescorted, whatever base they decide to target. And the Japanese player has aircraft at 3 different bases, and so what I'm doing now is sort of laying out the bomber units at Gazmata. So we've got 3 bomber units and 2 fighter units, and we've got 1 bomber unit in the arming position, which we're just gonna, for this step, we're just gonna leave it alone. There's nothing we can do. We're dealing only with aircraft in the ready box on this step. So we have 5 aircraft units that can potentially take off, but recall that we only have a air launch capacity of 3. And we definitely want to send some escorts with our bombers. So let's first send our bombers on the strike. 1, 2, 3. Okay. How do we get these other two? How do we get both these fighter units in the air if we have already met the launch capacity? Well, Rule 12b2 shows you that you can exceed the launch factor by up to twice the normal printed factor, but with some restrictions. So we've launched 3. We can launch these other 2 fighters because we can now double the launch factor, right? So 3 becomes 6, but the 4th, 5th, and 6th air units, here's how they're penalized. Let's say that we want to send 1 fighter on an escort mission. We can do that by placing any units in excess of the launch factor in the max strike box. This box represents the extra time it would take to get those aircraft airborne and spotted on the airfield, etc. So there's no real penalty other than the bottom right-hand corner. When placed in the max strike box, the bottom right-hand corner is the air unit's range, and it's effectively reduced by 1, from 7 to a 6. So that's why it gets placed here. It's just so it can remind the user that these air units have their range reduced. But we also see that the Americans are sending in a rather large unescorted raid, and we don't know where it's going to go, so why don't we send up some combat air patrol as well? That's what the low cap box is for. We've exceeded the launch factor, the only penalty we have to pay in regards to combat air patrol when you exceed the launch factor is that they're placed in the low cap box, and now the only real difference between these 2 boxes is that the low cap box can only attack other fighters, other torpedo bombers, and other medium bombers. They cannot attack high-level bombers or dive bombers. So we'll place 1 fighter in the low cap box and 1 fighter in the max strike box. From Leh base, Leh is the strongest. Here, I'll zoom it in here. Leh has the best defense factor between Leh and Gazmata, so we'll let Leh fend for itself, and we'll send this fighter in the normal strike box position. And the idea here is that we will join up with the airstrike coming out of Gazmata to provide additional escort. And finally, we have this air unit up at Rabaul. Now, this air unit's range is only a 6, however, or not however, and 6 hexes, there's no targets within 6 hexes from Rabaul, but Rule 12C1 helps clear this up. We're going to utilize the unequal movement legs. This rule helps clarify that an air unit actually has a range that is twice its movement factor, the printed movement factor, and this range doesn't have to be split evenly. But the practical effect here is that the Val dive bomber, this dive bomber unit, would move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and as long as it could move and land on a different Japanese base with its remaining 5 movement factors, 8, 9, 10, 11 to Gazmata, or 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 to Leh, then this is a legal move. So Rabaul will launch its dive bomber squadron with the intent to land at Gazmata or Leh once it's done with the raid. So we'll place it in the normal strike box. Okay. The assembly step is complete, and now now's the time. This is the ready step where we shift air units that were in the arming box or the ready box. This is where you can switch between the arming and the ready boxes. So ready aircraft that you didn't want to fly can be shifted to the arming box if you want to fly them on the not this turn, but on the following turn. And air units that are in the arming box are shifted to ready box to fly next turn. So the Japanese have 1 air unit in an arming box. They'll now move it over to the ready box, like that. Next would be the sea movement step, but there are no ships in this little tutorial that I've rigged up. Then we do the air movement and search step. Flying air unit, this is kind of an important step because this is the point at which flying air units, the air units that have been designated to fly, are moved from the operations card and onto the search board. Now, normally searches are conducted first and then raids, but because we're not dealing with scouts, we're just trying to demonstrate air combat rules. We're going to skip the search step, or the searching, the point at which you would search, and go straight to movement and then conducting combat. So since the the Allied player was side B, we'll start with them first. And we will place this stack of bomber units on the search board on the Port Moresby hex, the point of origin. And we'll go ahead and check the range of each of these aircrafts. It looks like the slowest one in the group has a 5 hex range. We could split our attacks between Leh and Gazmata, or we could split them between Leh, Gazmata, and Rabaul. We can send these long-range heavy bombers out to Rabaul. But we're going to just consolidate everybody into one large attack group, and let's, since it's my tutorial, I'm going to send them all to Gazmata. So this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, and we just leave it there for now. Now keep in mind your opponent doesn't know where you move to the attack groups. If you split them up, if you went for one target, how much of your attack force has gone to an individual target, this is not known to your opponent. There's another benefit to being in the high cap box here as opposed to the low cap box, and that's that some or all of the fighter units at this point may be moved to another friendly base or task force marker to provide combat air patrol, as long as it's within their movement factor during their side's air movement and search step. So we have the option, since the range for all of these fighters is 3, we have the option now of moving some or all of these units to the Gilly Gilly base, which started out with no air units to speak of at the beginning of this tutorial. And we'll do so. We'll send 2 full fighter squadrons out to the Gilly base for high cap as well. So we've basically split our fighters. So no matter what the Japanese attack, there will be a reception there. In fact, I'll make it even more interesting. Let's put this weakened fighter air unit over Gilly Gilly as well. I guess the reason I did this is because Port Moresby has a defense factor of 7 and an AA factor of 5 and is not flipped. Gilly Gilly is much worse off in all respects. Doesn't need as much. Port Moresby doesn't need as much combat air patrol. But anyway. Okay, now the Japanese will move. Let's get their search board rigged up here. First, let's take the Gazmata raid, stack them up. Most Japanese air units have a very long range, so the fact that this escorting fighter went from a 7 to a 6, it really doesn't affect us too much. We can move 1, 2, 3, and 4 when we're on the target. But I'm going to back it up 1 space, and I'm going to show you why. Remember that we have other air units who are trying to participate in this raid, and this requires a little bit of understanding of the rules. Rule 13 penalizes attacks from different air bases and different task forces by making you roll a die and only attacking in sequence. So if the group from a carrier and a group from a base arrived at the same target, they'd have to roll a die to see which one showed up first. Highest roller would be first, the next lowest would be the second raid, and the third lowest, and so on. This can be extremely inconvenient to the attacker, as it allows the defender to shoot multiple rounds of anti-aircraft, multiple rounds of fighting off the combat air patrol, and so what can the attacker do? Well, they can utilize the rule combinations, and all that the attacker has to do to avoid that penalty is move through a common hex, where one or more airstrikes combine into one airstrike before moving out of that search board hex. So in this case, the Japanese are going to form up in hex D6 here, right? So we'll fly the unit out of Rabaul. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. And the fighters from Ley, 1, 2, 3, 4. And now we'll move on to the basic gilly-gilly. Okay? So again, the allied player doesn't see all these movements. They only see the pieces on the operations, leaving the operations card and going onto the Japanese search board. They don't see the actual movements, okay? All right, so we're done with everything, and it's time to get to the combat. This is the combat phase, where individual battles are conducted in any order determined by side A. And for simplicity's sake, we'll start with the American airstrike on the Japanese base. So the first thing we want to do is set up the airstrike. So the first thing we're going to do is put the units on the battle board. So we'll take the fighter that's on low cap at Guadalcanal base, put him onto the battle board, and we'll put all the air units and the base itself on the battle board. Okay, so here we have everybody set up on the board. The American airstrike all laid out. I'll say why I put these high-level bombers separate here in a moment. We have the fighters between us and the base, and then finally the base itself. Okay, the first thing we're going to conduct is the air combats. And in this case, since there are no escorting fighters, we're going to resolve the fighter-to-bomber air combat. In other words, the combat air patrol fighter will be allowed one round of combat against a unit of its choice out of the Allied bombing fleet here. However, remember this fighter was on low cap, so these two high-level bombers are not eligible targets. So we'll set those to the side, and then the Japanese player would select one of these targets. Let's go for... Well, there's a couple different things that might go into the rationale of the Japanese player. We want to watch out for the bottom left-hand corner of each of these bomber units. This is a representation of the bomber's ability to defend itself after it's been shot. So maybe we're not going to go for this one because it's got a 3. This one's pretty weak, but it's flipped. Why don't we go for one of these? We'll go for this guy right here. Okay, let's conduct one round of combat. So we'll look at the Zero's attack factor, or this Japanese fighter's attack factor. It's a 6, right? Bottom left. We'll roll 1d10 and add 6. There's really no modifiers to this at all. The Japanese player rolls a 5, so we have an 11. The defense factor of this torpedo bomber unit is a 2. Allied player rolls a die, rolls a 2 for a modified 4. 11 to 4. So the Allied player has been exceeded by 2 times as much, but not 3 times as much. So this unit will be flipped to its backside, and then it will be allowed to shoot back at the attacking fighter. So it's sequential. It's not simultaneous. So the Allied player will roll 1d10, rolls a 6, adds in the now 1 reduced air combat factor for a modified 7, and the Japanese player rolls a dice, rolls a 10. So this is a miss. The combat air patrol is now set aside, and we will conduct anti-aircraft combat. And Rule 4C 2.1 has the modifiers for anti-aircraft combat. So there will be a -2 modifier if we are firing at high-level bombers, as the Japanese, and a -1 if we are firing at air units that are using the medium-level bombing classification. So it might seem at first glance that we would want to go for these torpedo bombers. However, not much further down from that previous rule, Rule 4D 1.4 states that medium-level bombing must be the category used by torpedo bombers when attacking a base unit. Obviously, no base would be attacked by actual torpedoes. So these are all medium bombers except for the high-level bombers. Our anti-aircraft factor is a 3. It goes down to a 2 when we shoot at any of these torpedo or medium bombers. So we will just try our luck with the weakest bomber unit right here. This one that has a defense factor of 0. So the Guadalcanal base rolls its dice, rolls a 4, which punches up to a 6. And the Allies will roll a dice in defense, and they roll a 2. So this actually is 3 times as much as the the Japanese have rolled 3 times as much as the Americans. The unit is completely destroyed, but it was already a half unit anyway. So it's eliminated, removed, and now we start the bombing run. Bombing combats are conducted in the following manner. You will essentially combine the bombing factors of every single type of bombing category. So all 4 of these bombers are using the medium level bombing category. So this 7 will add to the 3, become a 10, add this one, it's 13, and then this one finally becomes a 19. This 19 is then modified by a bombing modifier. In this case, a -4 applies for a medium level bomber or bombing combat if the target unit is a base unit. So 19 minus 4 becomes 15. The allied player, those are the only modifiers that apply on the offense or the defense in this situation. So the allied player rolls a d10 and rolls a 10. Wow. So this 15 becomes a 25. The Japanese roll a d10. They roll a 3. So add the defense factor of 4. That becomes a 7. So this is exceeds 3 times as much, and Gasmata base is removed from the from the search board. There's no need for these high-level bombers to roll, but if they had, they would have had a combined bombing factor of 8, and a -1 for high-level bombing versus a base unit, which would have been an attack of 7. But the Allied side got very lucky on their medium bombing roll, so it wasn't necessary. So we now pack up the surviving aircraft and return them to the US search board, like so. It's important to note that the Japanese player should be removing their own marker from their search board, so Gasmata no longer exists. Now, in this case, there was actually a unit on the ground. When the base is destroyed, all the air units on it are quote-unquote effectively taken out of the game and counted as points, right? So this reflects the damage being so severe to the base that any air units therein are no longer going to participate in the battle over the next few days. So these are scored in the Allied favor. They will get points for the destruction of this air unit, as well as the base. For the time being, though, the base was destroyed. We will place this fighter aircraft back in the low cap box. It will still be allowed to fly back in the air return phase to a different base that's in range. We'll now partially resolve the Japanese attack on the Gili Gili base. Here we have the combined Japanese air attack ready to attack the base. We now will pull the cap units, or the units that were designated for combat air patrol. Put them on the battle board. So we're just going to resolve the air combat. This is just for purposes of time. So in this situation, we have a combat air patrol and escorts. So this is how this will be resolved. Escorts get to fire first. There's nothing simultaneous. It's sequential, and they have to be attacked. Combat air patrol units and escorting units have to attack each other at 1-to-1. So the full fighter groups would attack each other, and then any excess units, as in this half fighter squadron, would then be added to one of the other. So the Allies will just drop one here, okay? Now, the escorts get to fire first, and this escort will decide to shoot this weakened fighter unit. So we'll roll 1d10 for the Japanese. They roll a 3. Add 7, that becomes a 10. The Allied player rolls a dice. They roll a 3. This becomes a 4. So they roll 2 times less than the Japanese. So this unit will be destroyed because it's already flipped. It's flipped again. It's destroyed. Then the Allied side would get to shoot back. In this case, our remaining fighter has an attack factor of 4. We roll a 6 to the Japanese dice roll of 8. So 8. And the defense factor is 2, so this is a 10 versus a 10. So even Steven goes to the defender. In this case, the escorting fighter is unscathed. So that's the end of that combat. And here the Japanese will get to shoot again. First, they roll a 4. Modifies to an 11, and the allied player will roll a dice. They roll a 7, modifies to a 9, so a 1-hit marker is placed on the defending combat air patrol fighter. So we'll put it here and put it under the counter. Now the allied side will get the fight back, but at the reduced rate of 3 instead of 4 due to the 1 hit. We roll a 4, add 3, it becomes a 7. The Japanese will roll a dice. They roll a 4, it becomes modifies to a 6. So the Japanese fighter takes a 1 hit. And this concludes the air combat. And we would normally commence with the bombing raid like normal. But let's say that in one of these combats, let's say in that last final combat, that the Japanese fighter got very lucky, and didn't just put a hit on the fighter, but destroyed it completely. This would qualify as a breakthrough for the escort side. The escorting fighter would then be allowed what's called a strafing attack. In other words, it's shooting up the base's anti-aircraft ability to fire anti-aircraft guns, and the Gilly Gilly would be reduced from a 2 to a 1 for each strafing fighter. Conversely, if the Allied side had been lucky and downed this entire fighter squadron, it would have gotten a breakthrough and been allowed a round of combat against one of the escorting bombers before it got to attack the base. So this provides for a lot of interesting little nuances in regards to escorts and cap fighter units getting additional opportunities to do damage to their opponents if they do enough damage to each other in that first round of air-to-air combat. Okay. This is now the air return phase. See here at the end of the round we have the air return phase. Air units are returned to a base or task force for landing. For the Allied player, this is relatively easy. All fighter units and all bombing units will just simply return to the Port Moresby base and they'll land in the arming box. Okay. For the Japanese, however, this is a little more complicated. Now that Gazmata has been destroyed, it appears that most air units should try to make for Leh. However, Leh only has a capacity of 6 full aircrafts. But there are 7, including the fighter combat air patrol at Gazmata. So one of these air units, at least one of these air units, will have to make for Rabaul. So all the bomber units and fighter units will make for Leh, except for this single bomber unit, which has a range of 9, and flying out of Gazmata should easily make it to Rabaul. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's just in the outbound leg. Remember, the movements can essentially double to 18 as long as you land on a base X. 10, 11. So this bomber unit lands at Rabaul, goes into the arming box, and all these units that arrived over Leh will go into the arming box at Leh. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's a brief synopsis of air operations in the Midway Guadalcanal game system. This is the end of a round. We now would move the turn marker into the next portion of the daylight hours here and start from the top yet again. Thanks for watching this. All the best from the good captain, and bye-bye.